The night was pitch black, as if the sky itself had chosen to hide this corner of the world from view. The old pickup truck hummed on the deserted highway, its headlights shivering. James Harrison, a U.S. Army veteran, gripped the steering wheel tightly, listening to the quiet rustle of the tires on the pavement. His right leg, whose replacement had long been a prosthetic, was whimpering slightly. It was as if the weather knew how to remind him of the past. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sharp wail of a siren. Red-blue light filled the cabin and the flashing lights made James squint. His heart froze for a second before it began to pound frantically. A police car raced after him, honking for him to stop. "What is it this time?" James muttered, sliding his old cane into the passenger seat and pulling his papers out of the glove compartment. The veteran was always prepared: driver's license, military ID, a medallion marked Disabled War Veteran. Everything was at hand, in case he had to explain his life to the next defender of order. The pickup slowly pulled to the side of the road, the engine stalling. A moment later, an officer stepped out of the police car. James felt a chill run down his spine. The uniformed man didn't even try to hide his hostility. His footsteps were quick, firm, as if he were on the hunt. As the officer stepped closer, James saw that his hand was clutching his gun tightly. Not a holster. A gun, pointed right at him. "Hands on the wheel, now!" the policeman shouted, his voice like a gunshot, loud and cutting. "Take it easy, officer," James replied calmly, raising his hands. His voice shook not from fear, but from the anger he could barely contain. "I'm a veteran, just on my way home. I can show you my papers." But the words only seemed to anger the officer. He grabbed the radio, said something inaudible, and then stared at James again, as if waiting for him to make the slightest movement. "Get out of the car! Slowly!" The gun rose higher, its muzzle seeming to burn through James's chest. The veteran obediently reached for the doorknob, but his movements were difficult. His war-traumatized body was reluctant to obey. The officer stepped closer. "Come on, hurry up," he growled. As James climbed out, leaning on his cane, the officer's gaze lingered on his leg. The prosthetic gleamed in the headlights. Instead of sympathy, contempt flashed in the officer's eyes. "Oh, I see," he said. "You think that gives you the right to drive around as you please?" Those words hit harder than any fist could. James felt a deafening wave of rage rising inside him, but he knew that the slightest objection could spell disaster. "Officer," he began, trying to keep his voice steady, "I haven't violated anything. Let me explain. I said, get down." The officer roared in such a way that the silence around him shook. James glared at him, his pride screaming to resist, but common sense was winning. Slowly, trying not to lose his balance, he sank to his knees. The cold asphalt dug into his fingers. In that minute, as he stared up into the night sky strewn with sirens, James realized this night was going to be more than just a stop on the road. "On your feet! On your feet now!" The officer's voice sounded like a whiplash. James, leaning on his cane, rose slowly. He could feel the icy night air stinging his skin, but the cold didn't come from the weather. It came from the man with the gun in front of him. The policeman held his gun at the ready, as if the veteran leaning on his cane was a dangerous criminal. "What are you doing here, huh?" growled the officer. "You're out at night. You must be up to something." James tried to speak calmly, his voice sounding low and steady. "Officer, I'm coming home. I'm a veteran, served in Iraq and Afghanistan. I have all my papers. I can show you." But James's words were like ashes blowing in the wind. The policeman stepped closer, his face contorted with contempt. "A veteran, you say?" He grinned, his voice oozing sarcasm. "I thought they recruited people who could walk without sticks." James felt something boiling inside him, but he forced himself not to react. The situation was already too dangerous. "I lost my leg in the line of duty, officer," he said, pointing to the prosthetic. "That's my cane." The officer squinted, his eyes sliding over the cane, then back to James's face. "So what? You think that gives you the right to break the law?" He stepped closer, his voice growing louder. "Or do you think your skin and your heroic history let you do whatever you want?" The officer emphasized the word skin in particular with a venomous pressure. James felt his breathing quicken. He'd seen this kind of situation before, heard this kind of intonation. The words were a sharp knife aimed at his heart. "I didn't violate anything," he answered firmly. But the officer wasn't even listening. His voice continued to press, the anger in it growing like a thunderclap. "What's in the trunk? Drugs? Weapons? Or maybe stolen goods? People like you are always hiding something." "People like me?" James couldn't help himself, his voice growing louder. The policeman immediately roared, "Don't you shut my mouth! Don't look at me! Lower your eyes, God damn it!" James closed his eyes, fighting himself, trying to suppress a wave of rage. Every word this man spoke was soaked with racism and hatred. Every gesture was a display of power and contempt. The officer stepped closer, his face now a few inches away from James. "You know," he whispered in a cold voice, "I don't care who you were. You're a nobody in my town. You understand? Nobody." He abruptly snatched the cane from James's hands, causing him to stagger back. "And this?" The officer twirled the cane in his hands, as if examining it. "Are you proud of it?" He laughed, a low, evil laugh, and threw the cane to the ground so that it fell into a puddle on the curb. James gritted his teeth, his hands clenched into fists. He could barely stand without his cane, but he knew that if he made a move, it could end tragically. "Now, listen to me," the officer continued, raising his gun again. "You're going to do exactly what I say now. Understand? And don't make a move, or your heroic story ends right here." The veteran answered nothing. His eyes met the officer's, and there was so much pain in them that even the man in front of him froze for a second. But that second passed quickly. "I said, you got it?" the cop roared. "Got it," James replied, looking out into the night, feeling it shrink around him like a trap. Let's take a short pause. Write in the comments where you are listening to our stories from, whether you have faced similar situations in your life, and how you dealt with them. We value your opinions and experiences. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation of this exciting story. And now we continue. "Face down on the ground," the officer shouted angrily, raising his weapon even higher. "I'm not going to say it again." James glanced at him, but didn't say a word. His silence seemed only to anger the policeman more. The sirens blinked, their flashes cutting through the darkness, as if to emphasize the humiliation he was feeling. "Are you deaf?" the officer continued to shout. "Or do you think that your skin color gives you the right to disobey?" Each word struck like a whip. James gritted his teeth and slowly sank to his knees. The asphalt was cold and rough, digging into his palms as he lay face down. His cane was still lying in a muddy puddle, abandoned like trash, and the creaky breathing of a policeman sounded nearby. "Hands behind your back, wider legs," The officer continued to order and then added with a venomous grin, "Yes, like in prison. I think you know how it's done." James heard the cop's heavy boots step closer. The officer leaned over him, gun still pointed at the veteran's head. "Look at you, a war hero, crawling on the ground like a worm," he said, grinning. "Maybe that's where you belong." James wanted to answer, wanted to say something, to defend his honor for a moment, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he felt the officer shove him sharply with his boot, causing his body to roll slightly to his side. "You're pathetic," the officer continued, his voice loud and mocking. "Maybe if you hadn't gone to war and got a normal job, you wouldn't be here. Now lie down and don't move until I decide what to do with you." The officer's chest camera flashed red, recording everything that happened. Every humiliation, every insult was recorded, and it would all be preserved. But that gave James no comfort. He knew that such records were often lost. "Look, maybe you brought something with you, huh?" The officer suddenly changed his tone, like he was talking to himself. "Maybe this is my chance to catch you for something real." The officer began rummaging through James's pockets, roughly turning over his belongings. The medallion with his military number fell to the ground. The officer picked it up and grinned. "Wow, look at you, a real hero," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Except I don't care who you are. You're just another guy here who thinks the laws don't apply to him." James remained silent. He felt humiliated, angry, but most of all tired. It was too familiar, too predictable. "Get up," the policeman ordered. "I want you to explain something to me." James rose slowly, leaning on his sore leg, his gaze meeting the officer's. The policeman smiled. His smile was cold and cruel. "Tell me, veteran, did you ever think that all your merits meant nothing?" he asked. "After all, at the end of the day, you're still just you." The words hung in the air like smoke. The night grew even colder, and James realized that this conversation was just beginning. "Well, come on, spill it, hero." The cop leaned against James's car, his gun still in his hand. "What makes you think you're so special?" James stood swaying on his sore leg, his breathing heavy. He stared at the officer, trying to find words that would break through the wall of prejudice, but he knew it was useless. "I served," he said at last, his voice firm but quiet. "In the U.S. Army. 15 years. Afghanistan, Iraq. Lost a leg in combat protecting my comrades." The officer froze, and for a moment something like surprise flashed across his face. But it lasted only a second. Then he laughed, a rough, loud laugh that echoed across the deserted road. "Protecting your comrades?" He raised his hand to his forehead as if parodying a salute. "Well, thank you, Mr. Patriot, except I don't see your service saving you now." He stepped closer, his face becoming menacing. "Listen to me, soldier. You can tell your tales to somebody else. I see your kind every day. You think just because you put on a uniform and go to a hot spot, you owe everybody? Well, nobody owes you anything. You understand?" "I'm not looking for privilege," James replied firmly, his voice already beginning to shake with suppressed anger. "I just want to be respected." The policeman grinned. "Respect?" he interjected, stretching the word. "Are you serious? You have to earn respect, not just hope you get it because you suffered for someone." His gaze slid down to James's prosthetic. "And this thing? Is that a medal?" He jabbed his finger at James's leg. "You know, I don't think you lost it in battle. I think you probably ran away from the battlefield, maybe blown up by your own stupidity. Guys like you always do stupid things." Each word hit like a bullet. James clenched his fists but didn't move. He knew that if he let his anger flare, it would end badly. "Do you know you're pathetic?" the officer continued, "trying to use your story to make yourself look like a hero, but you're just another kid who wants sympathy. Well, I'm sorry, but I don't care about you or your war stories." James took a deep breath. "You don't know what I've been through," he said. His voice was stronger, but still calm. "You don't know how much blood I've seen, how many friends I've lost, and you certainly don't know what it's like to come home, to be considered second class because of your skin." The policeman narrowed his eyes. "Don't you dare talk to me about difficulties," he said coldly. "I work every day with people who think the law doesn't apply to them. You're no better." "I've earned my place in this world," James said, his voice sounding like a gong. "And you? What have you done besides humiliate people?" The policeman stepped closer, his face contorted with anger. "Do you want to know what I did?" He raised his hand, as if about to grab James's chest. "I'm protecting this town from people like you, from people who think they can live by their own rules." "People like me?" James looked the officer straight in the eye again. His gaze was hard, filled with bitterness and pain. "You don't even know who I am. All you see is the color of my skin." The seconds stretched into eternity. The night seemed even darker, as if the earth itself was frozen, watching the scene. James stood still, his back straight despite the pain in his leg. The policeman continued to glare at him, as if trying to find something in him to destroy. But something flared inside James. It wasn't anger, but pride. Pride in his service, in his sacrifices, in the fact that he was still standing, despite everything this world had thrown at him. And in that moment, he realized that he would not let this man take away the most important thing of all his dignity. The dim light of headlights illuminated the road as several cars slowed down, passing the scene playing out on the side of the road. The people in the cars paused, trying to figure out what was going on. The faint light of the street lamps barely made it possible to make out figures. A lone man standing in the crosshairs of a police gun, his body tilted slightly forward from fatigue, but his gaze was hard. In one of the cars, the woman grabbed her phone, turned on her camera, and started filming. "Do you see that?" she said to her companion. "It's not normal." "Call 911, the man replied, pulling out his cell phone. "This could end badly." Slowly, as if the whole thing had been staged, a few more drivers pulled out their phones. The cameras on them recorded every moment. The officer's shouts, his gestures, every movement of James, who continued to stand despite his obvious fatigue and pain. "What the hell?" muttered one of the drivers watching the scene. "Is this even legal?" At the curb, the policeman looked back at the flashing headlights of one of the cars, his face contorted with irritation. "Get out of the way!" he shouted toward the cars, his voice cutting through the night like a thunderclap. "This is none of your business. Leave before I start writing parking tickets." But the cars weren't moving. The tension grew with every second. The footage continued, the cameras recording every detail, how the officer clutched his gun to his chest, how his voice became more and more aggressive. "I said, on the ground," he shouted again, glaring at James as if he were an enemy to be destroyed. "Don't make me use force. You don't want this to end badly for you." "Officer, I've already explained," James said calmly, though he sounded tired. I have no weapons. I'm a disabled war veteran. People are watching. You're recording it on your camera." These words seemed to add fuel to the fire. The policeman stepped forward, his face contorted with anger. "You don't tell me what to do," he growled. "You think I care about your story? You think I'm afraid of these cameras?" He turned to the passing cars, raising his hand as if ordering them to disperse. "Everybody get out of here," he yelled. "This is not a show, this is my job." But the people did not disperse. At first it was just a few voices. Then the shouts grew louder and louder. "This is wrong. We see what you're doing. Leave him alone." The officer turned to James again, his face crimson with anger. "See what you've done?" he said, leaning closer to James. "Now I'm going to have to deal with the crowd because of you. This is all you, okay? You and your stupid pride." But James didn't answer. His gaze was directed straight at one of the cameras behind the windshield of the nearest car. He knew someone was watching. Someone was seeing. And in that moment, he decided he wasn't going to break. Meanwhile, one driver in the crowd was already calling emergency services. "Something terrible is going on here," he told the cameraman. "A policeman is threatening a veteran. Yes, a war veteran. This must be stopped, and now." On the other side of the line, the operator had already begun coordinating the dispatch of another patrol. The situation was getting out of control, but the officer wasn't going to stop. His voice continued to echo down the road. "You think these people are going to save you?" He threw at James sarcastically. "You think any of them are going to come in here and take responsibility for your life? No one cares about you, okay?" James remained silent, but he knew that every second was being recorded, that every word spoken by this man would be used against him. And somewhere in the shadows, the witnesses the officer was trying to disperse kept filming. The cameras wouldn't turn off. They were the only hope for justice in this night that had become an arena of humiliation, pain, and pride. Silence hung for a few seconds, but it seemed like an eternity. The policeman, breathing angrily, glared at James, who was still standing, despite his obvious fatigue and humiliation. His face, normally impenetrable, became tense. He felt that the power he enjoyed had shaken a little. "Tell me what this medallion is," he finally growled, kicking the chain on the ground. "Another reward for being a loser?" James looked up, his gaze glowing with a mixture of pain and steely determination. He didn't feel like talking, but he realized that this moment was more than just a clash of aggression. It was a fight for his honor. "It's not just a medallion," he began quietly, but his voice sounded like steel. "It's a sign that I was a captain in the United States Army." The policeman froze. His eyes widened for a moment, and his face became rigid. It was the reaction of a man who had suddenly been shown that he was not facing just another black guy, as he had thought, but someone much more important. "Captain?" he interjected, his voice sounding sarcastic, but there was a tinge of confusion in it. "Are you saying you were someone important?" "I was a platoon leader," James continued. His voice grew more and more confident, but he kept his temper in check. "I lost a leg saving my men. I got a Purple Heart for it." The crowd began to whisper, some of the witnesses seemingly stunned. The cameras continued to record every moment. The policeman frowned, his face reddening. He clearly hadn't expected to hear that. His authority suddenly shook under the weight of James's words. But instead of admitting his mistakes, he stepped forward, increasing the pressure again. "So," he threw sharply, his voice louder, You think your rank means anything to me? That was then, and now you're just another man who thinks he can act the way he wants." He grabbed James by the shoulder and shoved him backwards. James staggered, barely able to stay on his feet. The policeman continued. "You think your Army career makes you better than me? You think your exploits give you the right to argue with the law?" James remained silent. His face remained stony, but inside he was seething. He could see that the policeman was not just trying to maintain his power now, but was proving something to himself. "You're not a hero," the officer continued, his voice growing more and more aggressive. "You're just a man who was stupid enough to lose a leg in a war that means nothing." Those words were the last straw. The crowd started shouting protests, and James raised his head and looked straight into the policeman's eyes. "You can keep saying what you want," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "but you can't take away who I am." The policeman, enraged and now clearly humiliated, grabbed James's chest sharply, pulling him down. "I'll show you who's boss," he hissed. But at that moment, from far away, I heard sirens wailing. Reinforcements. The officer froze for a second, his eyes darting to the road. The witnesses began to move closer, their cameras recording everything. "You're in trouble, kid," one of the witnesses threw from the car, shouting loudly in the officer's direction. "It's all been taken down." The officer recoiled, his face contorted with rage, but now it was fear. James still stood, his rank and dignity shining in the night darkness like a beacon of justice. The sirens were getting closer, and the night was finally beginning to turn against the aggressor. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from, whether something similar has happened in your life and how you dealt with it. We want to know your opinions and experiences. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. And now we continue. The sirens grew louder, filling the deserted night road, making even the staunchest witnesses feel the tension. The light from the headlights of the second police car cut through the darkness, making the shadows even more ominous. James was still standing, despite the pain in his leg and the anger in his chest, his eyes fixed on the approaching car. The car stopped with a squeal of tires, and a second officer got out. He was a stout, middle-aged man with a tense expression on his face. His eyes ran quickly over the scene. James standing with difficulty, the crowd of witnesses with phones in their hands, and his colleague clearly trapped in his own anger and pride. "What's going on here?" the second officer asked, his voice harsh but controlled. "We have an intruder here," the first officer said without even turning around. His tone sounded like he was trying to hide his uncertainty. "This guy." He resisted. He was defiant. "I'm on it." The second officer looked at James more closely. His gaze lingered on the medallion, which was still on the ground, and on the prosthetic partially hidden by the folds of his pants. The man's face softened for a moment, but then became serious again. "Captain Harrison?" he asked quietly, as if he couldn't believe his eyes. The first officer turned around sharply, his face contorted with surprise and irritation. "Do you know him?" he asked incredulously. "I know," the second officer replied, his voice hard. "This man served in our army. His name should be familiar to you. He was awarded the Purple Heart. He lost a leg defending our country. Now," he raised his voice, "tell me what you're doing with him here on the side of the road with a gun in your hand." The first officer blushed. His gaze darted between his colleague and the crowd, which was now moving closer, recording every detail. His eyes read fear, but his stubbornness still wouldn't let him give up. "He disobeyed orders," the first officer blurted out. He started telling his stories, thinking his status entitled him to. "That's enough," the second officer interrupted sharply. "Are you listening to yourself? Do you realize what you've done? You're standing here, humiliating a veteran, a man who has done more for this country than you will probably do in your entire life." The first officer blushed again, but now with anger. "It doesn't matter," he shouted. "The color of his skin, his rank, none of that means he can break the law." The crowd gasped when they heard those words. Even the second officer was stunned for a moment. His face became as hard as stone. "Do you realize what you just said?" His voice was cold and threatening. "Do you realize that this moment will be recorded? That it will go into the report, into the cameras, onto the internet?" The first officer took a step back, his self-confidence beginning to melt. He tried to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. "Put the weapon away," the second officer ordered. "Now." The first officer slowly lowered his gun. His hand shook as he put it back in its holster. "Now," the second officer continued, turning to James. "Captain Harrison, I sincerely apologize for my colleague's actions. It was unacceptable, and I will personally see to it that he is held accountable for his words and actions." James nodded, his face still serious, but you could see the relief in his eyes. He knew this night wasn't over, but for the first time in a while he felt that justice might be served. The howling of sirens in the background continued as a harbinger that justice was about to come. The lights flickered in the darkness, casting long shadows on the side of the road. The atmosphere was tense, like a taut string ready to burst at any second. James stood silent, his back straightened despite the pain, as if he were once again on parade from his days in the service. His gaze was directed at the second officer, who was now clearly dominating the scene, trying to take control of the situation. The crowd of witnesses armed with phones did not back down, their cameras continuing to capture every moment. The first officer, who was now clearly beginning to be gripped by panic, looked like he had been caught red-handed. He tried to remain confident, but his trembling hands and frightened look gave everything away. The second officer, wasting no time, walked to his car, called the dispatcher, and briefly ordered a check of his colleague's service records. His voice was cold and businesslike, the steel of a man who no longer intended to put up with injustice. He clearly saw that the situation had gone too far. James didn't say anything. He knew that words could only make the situation worse. Instead, he stood in silence, turning his gaze to the crowd, where a few people seemed to be beginning to realize that they were witnessing something truly significant. A few minutes later, the second officer received a reply. His face was nonchalant at first, but as he read the information, his expression became more and more stern. He slowly turned to the first officer, who now looked like a hunted animal. "Williams," he began quietly, but there was a threat in his voice. "Not only have you overstepped your authority, but you seem to have been on the verge of disciplinary action for a long time." The first officer, surnamed Williams, froze. His face turned pale and he tried to say something, but the second officer continued, interrupting him. "2 incidents of misuse of force in the last 3 years, he said, looking directly into Williams' eyes. "1 incident involving racist remarks while detaining a teenager. Another complaint from a family who claimed you threatened them with a gun for no reason. That's all I found in a couple minutes, and I'm sure there's a lot more if you dig a little deeper." The crowd, hearing this, began to whisper. Some shouted outrage. A woman from a nearby car said loudly, "This is why people like him shouldn't be in the police force." These words echoed down the road, adding fuel to the fire. Williams took a step back, his face red. He tried to justify himself again, his voice sounding squeamish. "It's not true," he shouted. "It's just that people want to find someone to blame who isn't afraid to tell the truth." "The truth?" The second officer interrupted sharply, his voice louder. "You call humiliating a veteran who lost a leg for this country the truth? You think your actions can be justified just because you have a badge and a gun?" Williams looked at the crowd, which was now clearly against him. His eyes darted around, looking for a way out, but his colleague wasn't about to back down. "We are not just co-workers," the second officer continued. "We are people who are supposed to protect society, not threaten it. And you have become a threat, Williams. You don't belong here." The crowd began to applaud. Several people shouted words of encouragement to the second officer. Williams seemed increasingly isolated. His hands were shaking and he took another step back, trying to justify himself. "Yeah, I was just doing my job," he mumbled. He was acting suspiciously. "Suspicious?" The second officer stepped forward, his voice full of rage. "You saw a man with a wheelchair standing in the road and you thought he was dangerous just because he was black? That's not a job, Williams. It's a disgrace." The crowd roared again. Cameras were pointed at Williams, recording his every trembling reaction. Now he no longer looked like a confident officer of the law. He looked like a man who knew he had been exposed. The second officer pulled a notepad from his pocket and began writing down the information. "You're off duty," he said without looking up, "and I will personally make a report on what happened here. Your behavior is unacceptable." Williams tried to protest, but the crowd began shouting accusations, overlapping his voice. The second officer turned to James, his voice softer. "Captain Harrison," he said, "I apologize for this incident. It is unacceptable and we will do everything we can to rectify the situation." James did not answer at once. His gaze was directed at Williams, who stood like a man who had lost everything. Then he looked at the second officer and nodded. The crowd continued to clamor, and in this crowd of voices, one thing could be heard. Justice was just beginning to be served. The incident on the side of the road did not remain in the shadows. The next morning, the first videos began to appear on social networks. The headlines screamed of injustice. Disabled veteran faces racism. Police officer humiliates war hero. The videos spread like wildfire, accompanied by thousands of comments. People expressed their outrage, asking the same question: how could this happen? James woke up to calls that didn't seem to stop. His phone vibrated nonstop. James's wife, Linda, was standing in the bedroom doorway, her face pale and holding a clipboard. "Did you see this?" she asked, showing him the screen. James was on the screen. Filmed from an angle that made him look even more vulnerable, he stood in front of the policeman as he shouted his humiliating words. The comments under the video were mixed. Most expressed sympathy and anger, but there were some that were hateful. "That's what these heroes deserve," one comment read. "Maybe if he had followed the rules, no one would have touched him. It's amazing that men like him could even be in the army. I guess the quota helped," added another. James felt something inside him clench. He already knew he couldn't run away from this story. It no longer belonged to him. It had become public knowledge, fuel for debates about racism, police brutality, and bias. First, there were calls from journalists. They wanted interviews, headlines, quotes. Some of them sounded sincere, but James also heard notes of sensationalism, a desire to use his pain to boost ratings. "Minus Mr. Harrison," said one journalist. "Your comments about racism in the police force can inspire millions. How do you feel about becoming a symbol of this struggle?" James answered briefly, "I don't want to be a symbol. I just want my family to live safely." But safety soon became relative. Within hours of the video gaining millions of views, the first threats began. Emails, calls to home phone numbers, even notes left under the door. Some were simple but threatening. "We know where you live." Others were more blunt. "You and your family will regret making this fuss." Linda tried to stay calm, but her voice shook every time she talked to someone on the phone. Their son, 14-year-old Marcus, looked scared. One night, when James went into his room, he found him sitting on his bed with his phone in his hands. "Dad, they say we're bad people," Marcus said quietly, showing the screen. "Why do they say that?" James sat down next to his son, putting his arm around his shoulders. "People fear what they don't understand," he said, "and sometimes they direct their fear at those who are different from them, but that doesn't make them right." But no matter how hard he tried to comfort Marcus, words couldn't eliminate the threat that now hovered around their home. The police offered temporary protection, but James knew that wouldn't solve the problem. He had become a symbol not only of anti-racism, but also a target for those who wanted to maintain the status quo. Meanwhile, the public outcry was only growing. Protests broke out in several cities. People took to the streets with placards chanting, "Justice for the veteran," "Zrania," "Stop police brutality." James had seen these scenes on TV, and while his heart was grateful for the support, he felt strangely detached. It was his story, but now it had a life of its own. Williams, the same police officer, was suspended from the force. It was reported that an internal investigation had been launched against him. But that didn't stop his supporters. Groups defending police officers began campaigning in his defense, claiming he was just doing his job. All of these allegations are a witch hunt. One leader of such groups said on live television, "Our officers face danger every day, and they should not be punished for trying to protect us." Those words ignited an even bigger flame. The internet was filled with discussion. James saw his name become a hashtag, his face appearing in memes and pictures. Some portrayed him as a hero, others as a target of ridicule. He sat in his living room with his arms around his head. Linda walked over to him, putting her hand on his shoulder. "It's not your burden, James," she said quietly. "It's not your fault the world saw the truth." But he felt guilty. Not for what had happened, but for the fact that his family was now at the center of this storm. He looked at Marcus, who was sitting at the window, staring at the police car in front of their house, and knew that nothing would ever be the same again. A story that began on the side of the road had turned into a battle for justice that now concerned millions. But for James, it was not a victory, but a reminder of how hard it is to fight for the right to just be human. A night that began as a routine homecoming ended with James Harrison becoming the centerpiece of a national scandal. But the justice that finally caught up with policeman Williams did not bring the relief that James had been so desperately waiting for. A few weeks after the incident, Williams was officially suspended from the force. A press release from the police department emphasized that his behavior violated professional standards and police regulations. However, the words sounded dry and official, as if the department simply wanted to close the case and brush off the scandal. James read the news on his phone, sitting in the corner of the kitchen, feeling an emptiness growing in his chest. It was a victory, but it seemed meaningless. The public reaction to the suspension was tumultuous. Some welcomed the decision, calling it an example of justice being served. Others, on the other hand, felt that Williams had been made a scapegoat in a system that was built on bias to begin with. Those supporting Williams began raising funds for his defense by organizing online campaigns. Insults, threats, and mean jokes against James and his family intensified. Now, they were not just victims of racism, they were demonized by people who saw them as a threat to their view of the world. Every day, James's phone was ringing off the hook. They asked him how he felt, what he thought of the decision, whether he was ready to participate in further trials. But James's answers didn't matter. Society had already decided how to interpret the story. For some, he was a hero. For others, he was a symbol of the collapse of the foundations. One evening, driving home from a meeting with his lawyers, James noticed the police car on duty outside his house had been replaced by a new shift. But that didn't provide a sense of security. The threats continued. One of the notes Linda found at his door was particularly ominous. "You think it's over, but we'll find a way to get to you." Marcus became withdrawn, avoiding conversation at school. Classmates apparently also saw the video and split into two camps: those who admired his father and those who brought printed memes to school, mocking the situation. "Dad, why are people so mean?" Marcus asked one day, sitting on the porch with James. James found no answer. He stared out into the night, seeing only the dark silhouettes of trees and the flickering lights of distant cars. He wanted to explain to his son that not all people were like that there was hope, but at that moment he didn't believe it himself. The trials continued. Williams appealed in an attempt to regain his seat in the department. His supporters organized rallies where they shouted slogans about the overreach of the system and pressure on the police. James had seen pictures of them on the news, people holding signs that read "Free Williams" and "Protect Our Defenders." But it was even more shocking to see posters that portrayed him himself as the enemy. One of them read, "You want respect? Follow the law." It was a low blow. James wanted justice, but instead he became a symbol hated by those who didn't want change. One day, while returning with groceries, he noticed a man standing outside his house. He was tall, with strong arms, wearing a jacket with a police emblem on it. When James got out of the car, the man stepped forward. "Do you think you've won?" he said coldly, looking James straight in the eye. "You destroyed a good cop's career. Now you're a hero to all those liberal cowards, but we won't forget. We won't forgive." James didn't say anything back. He just walked past him, trying to ignore the threat. But something inside him broke again. That night, those humiliations, those words, they no longer belonged to the past. They lived in every moment of his present. As he entered the house, Linda noticed his condition. "You don't have to hold it all in, James," she said. "We'll get through this. We have to." James sat down next to her, his gaze blank. "This night, it took more from me than the war, Linda," he said quietly. "Out there on the battlefield, I knew what I was fighting for. But here, I'm not even sure if victory exists." He fell silent, but Linda knew what he meant. This night had changed him. It hadn't just exposed wounds, it had left new scars that might never heal. A few months passed, and the public began to forget about the case. The videos lost popularity, comments became less frequent, and James and his family tried to return to normalcy. But normalcy was out of reach. Even when everything subsided, that night stayed with them like a shadow that couldn't be erased. Justice was achieved, but the price for it was too high.